The night Tatum Briggs almost didn't show up for her shift was the night everything changed. She'd been on her feet since 6 in the morning, first at the Hargrove Hotel doing linen inventory, then a 4-hour gap she spent eating a sad gas station sandwich in her car because going home and coming back cost more in gas than it was worth. And now, at 7:42 p.m., she was tying her apron strings in the back hallway of Soleil, a restaurant in the French Quarter that smelled like brown butter and old money. Her feet hurt. Her lower back had been sending distress signals since noon. The uniform, white blouse, black skirt, fit the way it always fit, fine from the front, pulling at the back, a reminder that this body was never the body the dress code had in mind. She was 26 years old. She weighed 263 pounds on a good day. She had worked at Soleil for 14 months and had never once been seated at one of her own tables as a guest. That was fine. That wasn't what tonight was about. The manager, a skittish man named Duval, met her at the pass-through with the expression he reserved for disasters. "Private dining room," he said. "Full buyout. I need you on that section tonight." Tatum looked at him. "Me? You're the best I have. Don't make it weird." She didn't make it weird. She picked up her order pad, straightened her blouse, and walked into the dining room. The man seated at the head of the long table in the private room was not the kind of man you immediately understood. That was, she would later think, the point of him. He didn't look like what he was. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, maybe older, with the kind of face that had been handsome for so long it had settled into something more than that. Authority, maybe. Certainty. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A charcoal jacket that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have always had expensive things. He was flanked by men in various states of alertness, none of them touching their food. His name, she would learn later, was Cormac Vale. Right now, he was just the man at table 1. "Good evening," she said, coming to his end of the table. "My name is Tatum. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start anyone with water, sparkling or still?" He looked up at her, not the quick, dismissive look she was used to, the one that slid right off her like she was made of glass. He actually looked at her, just for a moment. Then he glanced back at his menu. "Still," he said, "for the table." She went around pouring water, taking the temperature of the room. These men were not here for the food. The food was incidental. They were here because Soleil was the kind of place where the private dining room truly meant private. No windows, a single entrance, and a staff with enough financial incentive to have impeccable short-term memory loss. Whatever they were discussing had paused when she walked in and would resume when she walked out. She did her job. She took orders, refilled glasses, answered questions about the duck without editorializing. She was efficient and quiet and invisible in the way that she had spent years perfecting. Not the invisibility of being unimportant, but the invisibility of someone who had decided that being noticed in the wrong way was worse than not being noticed at all. It was on her 4th trip to the table that she saw it. She was coming in from the left side of the room with a tray of bread service, and she caught it in her peripheral vision. A man she hadn't seen before. Someone who had come in through the service corridor, not the main entrance. He was speaking quietly to one of Cormac Vale's men, a young one, mid-20s, who sat at the far end of the table looking like he wanted very badly to be somewhere else. The newcomer set something down on the sideboard near the wall. Small, dark glass. He left the same way he came. Tatum set down the bread basket. She thought about what she had just seen. She poured olive oil into a small ceramic dish. She placed it on the table. She went back to the service station and she thought about it some more. It wasn't her business. Nothing in this room was her business. Duval had been clear. Do the job, keep your head down. The gratuity on a private buyout like this one was more than she made in a regular week. And she needed that money because her mother's blood pressure medication had gone up again, and the math was not working the way math needed to work. She stood at the service station for 37 seconds, Then she went back in. The man at the far end of the table had a fresh drink in front of him. Amber, neat, in a crystal glass she did not recognize from Soleil's inventory. Not her pour, not her glass. She looked at it. She looked at the young man sitting behind it, who was looking at Cormac Vale with an expression she could not entirely read. Cormac Vale was talking. Something about logistics. She couldn't follow it. She didn't try to. "Excuse me," she said, appearing at the young man's elbow. "I'm so sorry. I need to swap that out. We had a situation in the kitchen with one of the bottles." She reached for the glass. He looked at her. He looked at the glass. "What kind of situation?" he said. "Temperature issue with the service," she said, which meant absolutely nothing, and she said it pleasantly, and she took the glass before he could say anything else. She walked out of the private dining room. She walked to the far end of the service corridor, past the kitchen, to a utility sink in the prep area. She poured the drink down the drain. She watched it go. It didn't look like anything. It didn't smell like anything she could identify. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was a glass of perfectly good whiskey, and she had just committed career suicide over a paranoid misread of a situation she had no business being in. She stood there for a moment. Then she put the empty glass on the rack and went back to work. She kept her face perfectly arranged for the rest of the service. She topped off waters. She cleared plates. She brought dessert menus and watched most of them get waved away. She did not look at the young man at the end of the table more than once, and when she did, she found him looking back at her with something she couldn't name. It was near the end of the evening, when most of the table had stood and moved into small clusters of conversation near the door, that Cormac Vale spoke to her directly. "Sit down," he said. She looked at him. "There aren't any chairs at your end of the table," she said. Something moved through his expression. "Then get one." She pulled a chair from the wall and sat down across from him. He was studying her the way she imagined he studied a lot of things, with patience and without warmth, but also without cruelty. Just assessment. "You took Aldous' drink," he said. Aldous. That was the young man's name. "I did," she said. "Why?" She held his gaze. In 14 months of restaurant work, and before that 3 years of hotel housekeeping, and before that a childhood spent learning to read rooms before she could read books, she had gotten very good at knowing when the truth was the safest option. This was one of those times. "A man came in through the service entrance about 90 minutes ago," she said. "I've worked this room for over a year. I know every vendor, every delivery schedule. I didn't recognize him. He left something on the sideboard. 20 minutes later, Mr. Aldous had a drink in front of him that I didn't pour." Cormac Vale said nothing. "I could be wrong," she said. "I probably am. But if I'm wrong, the worst thing that happens is I threw out a glass of good whiskey, and you dock it from my tip. And if you're not wrong, then we're having a very different conversation." He looked at her for a long moment. The room had gone quiet. She became aware, peripherally, that the men near the door had stopped talking. "What's your name?" he said. "Tatum Briggs. How long have you worked here?" "Tatum Briggs. 14 months, and in 14 months, no one has offered you a better job." She smiled, and it was not a happy smile exactly. More the smile of someone who had heard a version of this question before and knew all the places it didn't go. "I've been offered other jobs," she said. "I've been offered jobs that paid less and asked more. I've been offered jobs where I'd have to pretend not to notice certain things. I don't have a lot, mister." She paused. "Vale," he said. "Mr. Vale, but I have my ability to sleep at night." He didn't smile. She hadn't expected him to. What he said was, "The man who came through the service entrance. Describe him." She did. She had a good memory. She always had. When you grow up without a net, you learn to pay attention. She gave him height, build, the specific way the man had held himself. Right side dominant, some stiffness in the left shoulder, a jacket with a particular collar she'd only seen on one brand. She gave him the timestamp, the duration of the conversation with Aldous, the placement of what was left on the sideboard. Cormac Vale listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You can go." She stood up. She put the tobacco against the wall. She picked up her tray. "Tatum," she turned. He was looking at her with that same measuring expression, but something in it had shifted. A fraction of a degree, the way a compass moves. "Your tip," he said, "will not be docked." She nodded. She went back to work. She didn't think about it again. That was the only way to survive being the kind of person she was in, the kind of world she lived in. You made your decision, you acted on it, and then you let it go, because carrying it around would break you faster than the mistake ever would. She worked the closing shift. She helped break down the private dining room. She counted her tips in the car before she started the engine, because she'd learned a long time ago not to let yourself feel the full weight of relief until the money was actually in your hands. It was more than she'd expected. She drove home. She took her shoes off at the door of her apartment. She took ibuprofen and ate leftover rice, and fell asleep in front of a home renovation show she'd seen twice before. She did not dream about Cormac Vale, or so she told herself. He came back 3 days later. Not the whole party, just him and one other man, a quiet presence who stood near the entrance and looked at the room like he was making calculations. They sat at a regular table this time, in her section, which she noticed with a specific kind of calm dread. She went over. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome back." He looked up. "You remembered. I'm good with faces, so I've been told." He ordered sparkling water and the fish. His companion ordered nothing. She brought the water and the bread, and she left them alone. She took her other tables. She checked in when she was supposed to check in, and stayed away when she was supposed to stay away. She was good at her job. He watched her work. Not obtrusively. Not in the way that made her skin tighten the way some men's attention did. But she was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, something atmospheric, a shift in pressure. When the check came, he held it in his hand for a moment without opening it. "I'd like to offer you a job," he said. She stood at the table. She kept her face neutral. "Doing what, exactly?" "I have a house, a large one. It requires a certain level of staffing, management of the household, oversight of vendors, some scheduling. The person who handled it for the last 6 years left recently." "Retired?" "Relocated," he said, and something about the way he said it made her decide not to ask further. "I'm not a housekeeper," she said. "I mean, I've done it. But what you're describing is a management role," he said. "With appropriate compensation." He told her the number. She kept her face still, which was one of the hardest things she had ever done. "I would also need," he continued, "someone with your particular quality." "Which quality?" "You notice things other people don't. And then you act on what you notice, even when it would be easier not to." He put the check folder on the table. "That's not a skill you can train into someone. Either you have it or you don't." She thought about her mother's medication. She thought about her car, which was making a sound the mechanic had described with a grimace. She thought about Duval, who was a decent man, but who had never once put her name forward for the dining room manager position that had opened twice in the time she'd been here. She thought about the thing she'd poured down the drain 3 nights ago, and whether she'd made the right call, and whether this was, in some way, the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. "I'd need a contract," she said, "in writing." "Of course. And I'd need a week's notice here. I'm not going to leave someone short-staffed." He nodded. "And I don't do anything illegal," she said. "I want that to be clear from the start. Whatever your business is, I run the house. That's where it ends for me." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're negotiating," he said. "I'm setting expectations," she said. "Most people," he said quietly, "don't set expectations with me." "I'm not most people, Mr. Vale." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the same territory. "Acknowledgement, maybe." "Recognition. No," he said, "you're not." The house was a mansion. She should have expected that. And still, the first time she drove through the gate on a Thursday morning, with a folder of documents and a brand new work phone, she sat in the car for a full 60 seconds just looking at it. It was a Garden District house, one of the old ones, 3 stories, ironwork balconies, the kind of place that had existed long enough to develop opinions about itself. Magnolia trees in the front yard, a kitchen garden along the east wall that someone with actual taste had designed, and someone with less follow-through had allowed to get slightly out of hand. The housekeeper who walked her through the property that first morning was a woman named Georgette, who had been there for 22 years and looked at Tatum with the specific expression of someone reserving judgment, but not holding it indefinitely. "The south wing is his," Georgette said, moving at a pace that suggested she had somewhere better to be. "You don't go in without invitation. You don't ask what's in there. You order the pantry restock on Tuesdays. The florist comes Fridays. The security check-in is every morning at 8, and if you miss it, you will hear about it." "Who do I hear about it from?" "Mr. Vale if you're unlucky, Denton if you're lucky." She paused at a doorway. "Denton is head of security. He barks, but he doesn't bite." "And Mr. Vale?" Georgette looked at her. "Mr. Vale does what Mr. Vale needs to do." She moved on. Tatum followed. She made notes. She asked the right questions. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the vendor schedule, identified 3 billing redundancies, and resolved a standoff between the kitchen supplier and the catering coordinator that had apparently been festering for 2 months because no one had wanted to be the one to make the call. She made the call. Cormac Vale heard about it from Denton, who told her that Mr. Vale had said nothing, which Denton said, in his way of speaking, meant something. She was learning the grammar of this household, the silences that meant approval, the specific weight of an instruction versus a suggestion, the way the men who moved through the house, and there were always men moving through the house, in and out, quiet, purposeful, looked at her in the first 2 weeks with something between curiosity and assessment, and how, slowly, that began to shift towards something else. Not warmth, not exactly. Acceptance, maybe. She was part of the house now. She was known. She did not ask about the south wing. It was 6 weeks in when she realized that someone was lying to Cormac Vale. She didn't mean to find out. She was pulling invoices for a quarterly review. She was trying to identify where the household budget was hemorrhaging, because there was a gap she couldn't account for, and she found a discrepancy in the catering account. A duplicate vendor, a company that had been billing for services going back 18 months under 2 slightly different names, neither of which matched any actual work she could find a record of. She sat with it for a day. She checked it again. She cross-referenced. The payments went to a holding company. The holding company, she found through a level of database searching that she was not technically supposed to be doing, was registered to an address in Metairie. The address, when she looked it up, belonged to a man she had seen in this house, a man named Prescott, who handled Cormac Vale's external accounts and had the easy, careful manner of someone who had been trusted for a long time and had learned to wear that trust like a costume. She sat with it for another day. This was, she reminded herself, exactly the kind of thing she had said she didn't do. She ran the house. That was where it ended for her. Whatever else went on here was not hers to notice. Except that she had noticed. That was the problem with having the quality he'd described in the restaurant that night. The noticing didn't stop, just because you wanted it to. She went to find Denton. "I need 15 minutes with Mr. Vale," she said. Denton looked at her. "About household accounts." He studied her face. Whatever he found there made him nod once and reach for his phone. Cormac Vale's office in the south wing was not what she'd expected. She'd expected something imposing. Dark wood, overt symbols of power. What she found was a room full of natural light, bookshelves that looked actually used, and a desk covered in papers that had been organized by someone who thought spatially. He was standing when she came in, looking out one of the tall windows at the garden. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand," she said. "This won't take long." She put the folder on his desk. She walked him through it. She kept it clean. Numbers, dates, names, no editorializing. She had learned in 6 weeks that he did not need things explained to him. He needed information. What he did with it was his. He looked at the papers. He was still for a long time. "How did you find this?" he said. "I was looking for a budget gap, and the holding company, I was thorough." He looked up at her. "Tatum, I know it's not my place. I'm not going to say that." He looked back at the papers. "How long?" "The billing goes back 18 months. The holding company registration is 23 months old." He was quiet again. "I can leave these with you," she said. "Or I can take them back and shred them, and we can agree this conversation didn't happen." "Why would you offer that?" "Because I told you when you hired me that I don't do anything illegal, and I meant it, and I'm not sure what you're going to do with this information." "I'm going to handle it," he said. "That's what I was afraid of." The corner of his mouth moved, 1 degree, 2. It was the closest she had seen him come to a real expression in 6 weeks. "You're afraid," he said, "of consequences I can't predict. Yes, that's wise. I've had to be." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look which she'd also learned to do. He read evasion the way she read rooms, and there was no point. "Nothing will come back to you," he said finally. "You have my word." It was the first time he had offered her anything resembling a personal assurance, and she understood, from the way Denton had been behaving for 6 weeks and from every grammar of this household she'd been learning, that his word was not a small thing. "Thank you," she said. She left the folder. Prescott was gone by the following Tuesday. No announcement, no explanation. His access was revoked, and his name stopped coming up and the billings stopped. She noted all of this the way she noted everything. Catalogued it, let it settle, moved on. What she didn't expect was what happened on Thursday. There was a dinner. Not a private buyout like the one at Soleil, but a dinner here in the formal dining room she had been managing for 6 weeks, for 12 people whose names she knew only partially and whose presence in the house had a specific gravity to it. These were not employees, not associates in the usual sense. These were, she understood, people to whom Cormac Vale was accountable in some direction or another. She ran the dinner the way she ran everything, efficiently, invisibly. Near the end of the meal, Cormac Vale said her name, Tatum. She stopped at the doorway. "Come here." She came to the table. He was seated at the head, as he always was, and the 12 people at the table were looking at her with varying degrees of curiosity and blankness. "I want to introduce someone," he said. "Not to her. To them." His voice carried in the way it always carried. No effort, total presence. "Tatum Briggs. She manages this house. She has been here 6 weeks. There was a pause. "In those 6 weeks," he said, "she has done 3 things that required courage other people in her position would not have had. I want that noted." The room was quiet. "She is," he continued, and he said it without performance, without decoration, just flatly, as a fact, someone you treat with respect. In this house and outside of it, she felt something happen to her face that she couldn't fully control. It wasn't tears. She didn't cry, not here, not in front of these people, but something that was adjacent to it, something that moved through her chest and had to find somewhere to go. She thought about every room she had ever walked into and felt herself being looked past. Every job application where she'd seen the flicker in someone's eyes before they composed their face into neutral. Every uniform that didn't fit right. Every version of herself she'd had to leave outside a door in order to be acceptable inside it. He hadn't asked her to leave any of herself outside this room. "Thank you, Tatum," Cormac Vale said. "That's all." She nodded. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink for a moment with her hands braced on the edge of the counter, and she breathed. Georgette was behind her, doing something at the prep station, and she said nothing. But after a moment, she set a glass of water next to Tatum's hand, and that was its own kind of language. Later, weeks later, in the way that things unfold when you're living inside them and can't see the shape until you're past it, she would think about the sequence of choices that had brought her to this particular kitchen, this particular house, this particular moment. She had almost not gone in to work that night at Soleil. She had almost walked past what she saw on the sideboard. She had almost not said anything when he asked her to sit down. Every almost felt, in retrospect, like a door she had almost walked her through. And the thing that had stopped her, each time, wasn't bravery. She didn't think of herself as brave. It was something more stubborn than that. It was the specific exhaustion of having spent years making herself small for rooms that still didn't want her, and the slow, accumulating recognition that small was not a thing she could keep being. She had 263 pounds and 14 months of restaurant experience, and a brain that noticed things and refused to stop. And somewhere along the way, she had decided that these were not liabilities. They were not things to work around. They were what she was made of, and what she was made of had turned out to be enough. More than enough. In the Garden District house, with the magnolias going soft in the heat, and Georgette's glass of water still cool against her palm, Tatum Briggs stood in the kitchen and let herself feel fully what it was to be exactly who she was in exactly the right place. She finished her shift. She counted nothing in the car on the way home. She didn't need to anymore.